Topics in Math, Simplifying Square Roots Review Notes. This is on page 17 in your packet. So go ahead and work on those first two problems at the top where they are perfect squares and a perfect cubic. So what we can do is just take the square root of each of these individually. So if we take the square root of 16, that would just be 4. The square root of x squared for the variables, you can just divide the exponent by that number out front. So since it was a 2, 2 divided by 2 would be 1. So now it's x to the first. And then y to the fourth, the square root of y to the fourth, 4 divided by 2 would be squared. So the square root of 16x squared y to the fourth would be 4xy squared. And then we're not going to focus on the cubed roots ones today. So we're not going to do 3 and 4, but we can do this one. This one works out nicely. So we're, instead of thinking like the square root of 27, we're thinking what times what can get us to 27. So if we think of the cubed root of 27, that one's going to be 3 times 3 times 3. And then again, you can take that exponent and divide it by that number out in front. So it would just be 3x squared. So that if I multiplied 3x squared times 3x squared times 3x squared, I'd get what I started with. All right, so let's go ahead and look at when they don't work out perfect, when we have some left under the radical. So again, we're on page 17 here in your packet. All right, so if we have the square root of 50, we're going to think of that just like we would if it didn't have the x's and y's with it. So I'm just going to write that out front here, and we'll kind of think of that separate. We have square root of x to the fifth. Let me jot that down. And then we have the square root of y to the third. So I kind of think of it as like 3 separate problems there. So how we do the square root of numbers, think of all those perfect squares we have. Square root of 50, we could break that up into be 25 and 2. So 25 times 2 gets us to 50. For x to the fifth, because this is a 2 out here, we want even powers. So we could rewrite that as the square root of x to the fourth, but then what we have left under to make x to the fifth would be another x to the first, or just x. And then for the y's, we have the square root of y to the third, so the even one below 3 would be a 2, and then we'd be left with 1 left over. All right, so then we simplify. We say, what is the square root of 25? 5. But the square root of 2 is not a perfect square, so we leave that under the radical. Then we say, what is the square root of x to the fourth? For the exponents, remember, you can just divide by the root. If there is no root, it's a 2 there. So 4 divided by 2 would be x squared, not under the radical, but that x to the first is still under the radical. And then we have this square root of y squared would just be y to the first, or y, left with y under the radical. So then for your final answer, just put all the numbers that were not under the radical out front, 5x squared y, and then everything that was under the radical, put it together. So the stuff under the radical was 2xy. All right, go ahead and try that next one. So go ahead and pause the video and see if you can figure out how to do number 2. All right, for the 72, we can break that up into 36 and 2. If you did 9 and 8, that is not incorrect. You just have to go further because we can still take a 4 out of the 8. So we did 36 and 2. Now notice this is already an even power, so we don't need to break that up. We can just take the square root of x to the fourth, which is x squared. And then the square root of y to the 10th, again, another even power, so it's just y to the 5th. So then for your final answer, square root of 36 is 6. Bring that x squared and y to the 5th out front, and then you'd be left with the square root of 2. All right, we're going to skip examples 3 and 4 that are the cubed roots. We'll come back and do some of those tomorrow, but just go ahead and skip those for now. And jump down to number 5 and 6 here. All right, so for these ones, you have a choice. You can either multiply it all together right away, or you can simplify each radical. These numbers aren't very big, so I would probably multiply them right away. But if the numbers were like 13 and 15 or something, I don't know, not 13 and 15, maybe 13 and 28 or something like that, then I might break them apart first just so they're not such big numbers. But these ones aren't too bad. So if I want to put this all under one radical, I can multiply the 2 and the 8. So 2 times 8 would be 16. And then the x squared times x to the first, since x is written for both of them, you just add those exponents. So it'll be x to the third, and then y to the third, y to the fourth, y to the seventh. And then now we just do the same thing we did up above. So we break apart square root of 16, square root of x to the third, square root of y to the seventh. So we go, what is the square root of 16 is 4. For the x to the third, we can think of what's the even power. So it'll be x squared and you're left with 1. And then y to the seventh, you could do y to the sixth and y to the first. All right, so the 4 is going to stay there. X squared, square root of x squared. Again, divide those exponents by the index there, which is a 2. So 2 divided by 2 would get us to 1. But we still have it times the square root of x. And then over here, square root of y to the sixth. Since that's a 2, 6 divided by 2 is 3. And we still have a y. So then in our final answer, pull out all the ones that did not have a radical first. So 4xy to the third, and then times the square root of the 2 that did have a radical, xy. All right, why don't you pause the video and try number 5, or number 6. You didn't even do that last problem. All right, let's go ahead and take a look at it. So for the 18, we can pull out that perfect square, 9. 9 times 2 is 18. Square root of x to the fourth, it's already an even power, so we can just divide that by the index. 4 divided by 2 is 2, so x squared. And then y to the seventh, I could think of the even number below 7 is 6. We're still left with 1. So then we go, what is the square root of 9? 3. So 3 times square root of 2, we still have that x squared. What is the square root of y to the sixth? Since that's a 2, 6 divided by 2 is 3, y to the third, and then we still have that y at the end. So final answer should be 3x squared y to the third times 2y. All right, so for your assignment, what I want you to do is go ahead and get on Khan Academy, and there are 2 assignments to do on there. There's only 4 problems per assignment, I think. And after you do them, if you don't get a good score, you can keep doing it over and over to improve your score. So those scores will go right into Infinite Campus. So make sure you try to get a perfect score on those and just redo it as many times as it takes. All right, let me know if you have any questions.